Greetings and salutations. There have been over 10 riots during the Obama presidency, and while many people might feel race relations are deteriorating in this country, it's not yet time to proclaim it a civil war. However, it is high time to look at the civil and social situation in our country where far too many people are on welfare and food stamps because they are marginalized by an economy that seems more interested in debt slavery than decent wages. It's an economy that would rather imprison than educate. College sports make billions while their students go into trillions of dollars of debt. It seems at times that our society interchangeably proclaims the words debt and death. For America has become a global superpower, policing the waterways and skies of the globe. But since our Constitution calls for the general welfare of its citizens, is it time to end the century of war? After all, we watch the hawks because wars are not only waged abroad against foreign peoples, they are waged on their own people.
If you want to know what's going on in your city, in your streets, never back down like Tyrell, and the truth is what you seek. To analyze, investigate from the bottom to the top. You speak your mind like Sean Stone, whether they like it or not. I got Tabitha, Miss Wallace, with the wisdom and the pearl. Between the outrage and the evidence, what's going on in this world. Watching the hawks, watching the hawks, watching the hawks. Listen when they talk.
I hope you're ready for part 2 of our presentation of my new documentary, A Century of War, a reflection on the American century. Now, we dive into the inner city of Baltimore, which, like too many post-industrial towns, has been devastated by illicit drugs. The drug economy has literally replaced the industrial economy of the inner cities. While drugs spell a prison sentence or illness for most young men or women, it also means a quick injection of cash into a banking system that can then profit off the illicit capital.
I got 3 kids sitting on a corner in West Philadelphia, where I grew up, okay? They're generating $100,000 a year, say, of profits selling drugs, okay? You run that through a fast food restaurant, you know, that's trading at that time a multiple of 20 to 25 times, you can create $2.5 million on those kids, $2.5 million of market value, and that's before you lever it with debt and derivatives. So God knows what you could take it up to. Now, you don't have to educate those kids, you don't have to feed them right, you don't have to bring them up right, you know, but you can get them creating millions of dollars for you. So if you're looking for a lot of money fast, it's much easier to liquidate them than it is to bring them up properly.
America, with the largest prison population in the world, has over 2 million people incarcerated for criminal behavior.
Here's the amazing thing about this model. If you look at the flows within a place, the government is spending an absolute fortune for the game because you have all the enforcement of the war on drugs, you have the prisons, you have the local homeowners losing real estate value, you have all the costs of the crime.
In Sandtown, Penn North, where we were earlier today, it's insane. You have 1,600 vacant houses. You have 1,300 vacant lots where houses used to be. Yet you have all these people who have no housing. It's beyond blight. It really is it's a conscious process of depopulation. They don't want poor people to live here anymore.
Neurologist Ned Rosinsky looked into the phenomenon of what he called death zones in Baltimore as a correlation of poverty.
And it was pretty impressive, factor about 2.5. I was expecting to see it, but I wasn't expecting to see it as stark. A lot of young people die of infections, like they shoot up and they get endocarditis or serious infections, or they just don't get the health care that otherwise would have saved their lives from diseases that are not so bad. And so the younger the person is, the more years they lose.
This community was a social haven. Like, people came here to see all of the live performances, Cab Calloway and Billie Holiday. You know, this is the original Frederick Douglass High School. All of them attended school here. So it was a destination. There was a reason to come here. This is where African Americans that were pretty prominent came to enjoy themselves. And something happened. Decades and decades of being ignored. A community that's undereducated, underemployed, sub-housing. We're blocks away from public housing projects in 2015. People are still housed like animals in housing projects with barely running water or no heat. Children in households where dad is in jail or mom's in jail, or there's substance abuse issues, and children are raising themselves or their younger siblings.
You saw the city, it wasn't always this decrepit and dilapidated. This is urban blight, but you see these beautiful beautiful buildings that are just completely boarded up.
Refixed back.
Now people come back, and we could never have the businesses that the Koreans have in our community. They're not supposed to really be in our community, because the money leaves out of the community, doesn't come back.
Yeah, see, like these brothers over here, this is what they got to do now, sell clothes.
Right, they create their own little market here.
Their own little markets, you know, around here.
We try to be self-sufficient too. You know, he having that store there, that means we don't have to go up there to the Korean store around the corner around there. He stops and shortcuts. We can get a bottle of water for $1 here, where she just was telling us a bottle of water was close to $2.
Businesses really only invest when they think their demand for their products are going to increase. But if workers don't have money, the demand's not there. And so right now, our economy is really struggling along with inadequate demand. And in fact, you can take this point to much bigger. The reason we had a Great Recession, 2007 to 2009, we had a catastrophic economic collapse. And that occurred in significant part because consumers were sort of helping drive the economy along, but only by going into debt. As the Great Recession happened, this debt was inherently unstable. People could not continue to pay back the mortgages they were taking out on their homes. And so this huge downward spiral that really drove our country deep trouble, and now we're just struggling to get out of it, and I don't see us getting out of it unless we rebuild consumer demand.
I'm a trial lawyer. I've spent countless hours pouring through documents that tell the story about the ugliest side of corporate America. Fraud. Corporate media refuses to talk about these issues.
The conduct by this company was deplorable.
I'm going to paint a clear picture about how disturbing, how corrupt corporate conduct has become in modern America. These are stories that no one else can tell. I'm Mike Papantonio, host of America's Lawyer. Question more.
For decades, the American middle class has been railroaded by Washington politics. Big money corporate interest has drowned out a lot of voices. That's how it is in the news culture in this country now. That's where I come in. I'm Ed Schultz. I do the news on RT America. I'll make sure you don't get railroaded more.
People have got to know whether or not their president's a crook.
American people deserve to know answers.
What difference at this point does it make?
We must guard against the military-industrial complex.
The Cold War is over.
We shall never negotiate.
An American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima.
To know war is to know that there is still madness. Yet, we do what we must.
The only thing we have to fear is...
I am officially running.
The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted.
This is an election that will go down in history.
These states will decide this election tonight.
Welcome to our viewers in the United States and around the world.
We're taking an inside decision 2016.
I've never seen anything like it.
Weirder things have happened. Official.
This is a statement. Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States.
You gotta call it a major upset.
I'm your Shaw.
This is a changing night in American politics. It is amazing.
If globalization has been the mechanism by which corporations have found cheaper labor and goods to grow their influence in sales, then is corporate and financial globalization itself the problem? And if so, what can America do to protect itself from transnational predators?
Tariffs represented 100% of the income of the federal government from the George Washington administration to the Abraham Lincoln administration. 100%. All of the money was from tariffs. We used tariffs to protect domestic manufacturers, to keep manufacturing in the United States. The average tariff during that era was around 30% on pretty much everything. And we built this great industrial powerhouse. By doing away with tariffs, basically what we said to our manufacturers was, okay, you know, if you can make that pair of shoes for $1 in Connecticut and for, 50 cents in Mexico, go to Mexico. You know, it'll cost you maybe 3 cents instead of 50 cents. You know, here we are, naked in front of the world. And, in terms of the ability to protect ourselves. And I think it's bizarre that protectionism has become an evil word.
There was a time, during the New Deal era, when our government worked to provide the necessary tools for markets to thrive. In the 1930s, FDR's New Deal constructed thousands of bridges, roads, water supply lines, and provided electrification for the majority of the United States. In the 1950s, Eisenhower continued these policies, ordering the construction of the highways that connect our country from coast to coast. President Kennedy called for an initiative to put a man on the moon in the 1960s, giving birth to tremendous scientific innovations in medicine, computer technology, and travel. But how did we stray from that vision of endless growth?
The elites in the United States at the close of the Second World War realized that the Depression was ended as a result of the war. And so many of the elites felt that what we should do is maintain somewhat of a war posture or a military posture to be able to subsidize the nation and not fall prey to a depression. And what was built on that is, of course, what we call the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower did push for the road system on a basis of a military gain, but it absolutely was unbelievably brought prosperity, the kind of prosperity you're talking about that then shifted ground with the Vietnam War.
From 1965 until 1973, the United States engaged in a prolonged and bloody conflict in Vietnam that not only cost the lives of millions of Americans and Vietnamese, but cost the United States its trade advantage as it sank into debt to finance the war.
During the Vietnam War, and during the 1960s and early 70s, the entire U.S. balance of payments deficit was military. Military spending was pumping dollars into the world's central banks. If they'd spend it in Vietnam or in Japan, it would all be turned over to the French banks, the German banks, and they would cash in these dollars for gold.
Fearful that foreign countries trading in their dollars for gold would sink the value of the currency, President Nixon decided to break international agreements by restricting the dollar from further convertibility to gold in 1971. Instead of gold, oil would become the new commodity, unofficially backing the dollar. This petrodollar economy was sanctified in 1973, when the oil-producing countries of the Middle East, backed by Saudi Arabia, embargoed oil to the Western powers over their support of Israel during the Six-Day War. As the price of oil shot up 400%, global consumers paid the price at the pump, while the American banking system cut a deal with the Saudis.
And that deal essentially said that Saudi Arabia would invest them in U.S. Treasury securities, not give it back, but invest it in securities, and the interest from those securities would be used by the U.S. Treasury Department to hire U.S. corporations, essentially to westernize Saudi Arabia, to build petrochemical sites, desalination plants, in fact, whole cities out of the desert. Westernized cities. It was a process of really westernizing them. And also part of this deal was that Saudi Arabia agreed that OPEC would never increase the price of oil to any levels above what the oil companies would accept. And, very important one, that oil would only be traded in dollars. Now this is major because just before that, 1971, Nixon had taken us off the gold standard, taken the dollar off the gold standard. So the dollar's floating out there, and there's a real concern that the dollar's going to lose its power in the world. But by making sure that OPEC would only buy and sell, would only trade oil in U.S. dollars, it put us on a new standard, the oil standard, which in a way is more powerful than the gold standard in some respects. And we've been on that standard ever since, pretty much.
But it's not only the Saudis who are profiting from our addiction to oil. Wall Street brokers now transact hundreds of trades over every barrel of oil sold, turning energy futures into a speculative game of profiteering.
We started to move towards a financialization of key commodity markets, and beginning in 1981, we started trading on the New York Mercantile Exchange crude oil futures. And this was really the first foray to try and shift commodity pricing away from state oil companies and onto financial players. Before the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, about 85% of the trading volume in oil futures were done by producers and end consumers, with only 15% by speculators of the financial type. By 2010, that had become 85% speculators and only 15% producers and consumers. And so what we saw was a complete turnaround of the market, where a market that was originally designed to help get consumers access to fairly priced market had become just another Wall Street casino, Wall Street financial firms setting those prices.
It was Chase that had the most stronger relationships with the Middle East going into the 70s. They had a lot of oil relationships in particular. The former chairman of Chase, a man named John McCloy, had been a lawyer for the Seven Sisters oil companies, so that they could get into the Middle East and basically source the profits from petroleum profits that were denominated in dollars and extract those profits. They could use them for other types of international expansion, and that's exactly what they do. And so that became this circle of extracting the oil money, lending it out, going bust, having the government bail them out, and that became sort of the new normal.
While the tremendous wealth generated by petrodollars has exploded the international bank's collateral, deregulation since the 1970s has allowed banks to expand across state and national bounds.
And under the Clinton administration, we saw the demise of Glass-Steagall and a number of other laws that have been set up to separate the banking industries, that the commercial banks from the investment banks, and all these things that had been established after the Great Depression fell apart, came down, because the banks had enough power that they could force our elected officials, essentially, to do the things that they wanted done, which meant loosening all the regulations.
As banks have continued to consolidate more, it means that there are fewer banks imposing these relationships with their customers. So, for example, today the big 6 banks in the United States control 42% of the depositors' money in the United States. That's a significant load. That means that almost half the country has no other bank. So therefore they're tied into these relationships, and these large institutions, by virtue of being large and by virtue of understanding they have a captive audience, continue to pour money into extracting more from them. In other words, they can use deposits to leverage into speculative trading. They can use credit cards to dump on these same people who are giving them their deposits at higher and higher rates.
During this period, America was in the leadership position to basically rebalance the global economy. And one of the ways it did that was by shifting capital out of the United States and reinvesting it abroad. And in the process, financing some of that by globalizing and outsourcing labor.
This instrument of debt has not only been deployed against the American people, but against foreign countries in order to create conditions for corporate control of key resources and industries. In the process, American investments increasingly turned away from our country in search of higher profits abroad.
But for me personally, as I got into the business of being an economic hitman, and my real title was chief economist, but I was a con artist, was basically it, working for the World Bank. And I had grown up and gone to business school and with great respect and appreciation for things like the World Bank. But as I got into it deeper, I could see how this bank was just manipulating the world, and how that my job was, in fact, to use the bank as a vehicle for coercing countries with resources our corporations coveted into going deep into debt and putting themselves in a situation where essentially they had to give away those resources, things like oil, and privatize their public sector.
You look at oil, and oil is itself a multi-trillion-dollar-a-year commodity and industry. But when we spend money on oil, we are propping up some of the worst regimes on the planet. You look at Saudi Arabia that gets all of their money from oil. We say we hate ISIS for good reason. ISIS are terrorists. They behead people. Well, our allies in Saudi Arabia behead people too. And it's our dollars at work propping up that regime through the gas tank and then through direct military spending that we have. If we spend $700 billion a year on the U.S. military, what fraction of that is really about making sure that we have access to oil supplies? At least a couple $100 billion directly to the military budget is really about securing oil supplies. So the lifeblood of transport being oil has made us wedded to oil, and it's made us wedded to these regimes and states that don't share our values and that we would rather see go through a lot of change.
Much of the United States budget was financed not by taxes, but by foreign balance of payments deficit. The more Americans spent abroad, these dollars ended up in foreign countries. A lot of them ended up being paid for oil, and the oil countries ended up buying treasury bills, as did Europe, Germany, France, Japan. Japan especially, and Asia, were financing the American deficit. In effect, central bank reserves were based on American military spending. So foreign central banks were financing the surrounding so that they didn't really have a choice. If they wanted to politically break, they end up like Iraq or like Libya or now like Syria with having a regime change and an invasion. So basically countries were financing their own subjugation.
We have seen our military grow to encompass the globe with bases, along with direct military actions in dozens of countries on a daily basis. Our annual military budget ranges close to $1 trillion. Not counting the trillions that have simply vanished from Pentagon accounting books. Augmented by arms sales to countries like Saudi Arabia, our major industry, along with IT, banking, healthcare, and real estate, has become militarism.
And 9/11 was the perfect excuse to really go after militarization in a big, big way. And of course, since then, it just expanded. And it isn't just the industries that make the weapons. It's also their bankers, it's their insurance companies, it's their healthcare companies, it's the people that provide food to them, the Coca-Cola bottling companies that are in their location, and so on and so forth. So it's a mushrooming industry, and it's a savage industry. It's part of this death economy.
If we are to end this century of war and its economy of death, we will need new ideas. Promethean ideas like adapting fire to generate heat for energy rather than for bombs. We can develop technologies to fix the problems before us, rather than letting the economy of debt drive us into perpetual wars. How do we get back on that path of economic growth in a time when our leaders restrict our investments with fears of spending because we are now a nation in deep debt?
It's got to have an economic agenda, which it doesn't yet have, and one that addresses the fundamental problems of the out-of-control federal debt, the out-of-control private household debt of the country, and the fact that the economic policy of the last 30 years has let the industrial base of America go into the scrap heap and allowed outsourced by large multinational corporations to Asia and elsewhere. That has simply destroyed the productive work base of the traditional American economy. That has to be brought back.
So we need to turn this death economy into what I call a life economy. And I think this is extremely viable, and it can be an easy transition if we will just move forward with it. It means paying big companies to, instead of making missiles and war equipment, and make equipment to clean up pollution. Good Lord, our oceans are terribly polluted. Rivers around the world, lakes are very polluted. They can be cleaned up. The soil, the earth is polluted. The Amazon's polluted with oil and so many other things, and so much of the planet. The air is polluted. There's a whole industry, amazing businesses waiting there to clean these things up and to create new technologies for transportation and communications, energy, banking. And there's a huge opportunity here. If we could just put the U.S. taxpayers' dollars to work doing that instead of paying companies to make equipment and systems that kill other people.
Wealth drains out of the hands of hardworking Americans, and taxpayer money is stolen by bad accounting. But it begs the question, if the wealth is in the hands of the elite and their government puppets, is there a shadow government using all that capital to better control us? Catherine Austin Fitts and John Perkins give us their insider perspectives.
Starting coming out of World War II, we decided to run the country based on a high degree of secrecy. And we created the black budget, and we created an enormous infrastructure of businesses and governmental capacity that depends on secrecy, you know, and for all we know, I mean, clearly they've developed very advanced technology. So you've created this bureaucracy of secrecy, which creates a bureaucracy of privilege. So that was number one. And once you get vested and locked into that secrecy, it's very difficult to undo. How do you explain to everybody how you've basically been not telling them the truth for many, many years? You know, so it gets very tricky.
At the same time, we've seen the growth of the jackals here, you know, the people who use force to change systems or get rid of people that are bothering them, either physically or through reputation, through destroying people's reputations, through rumors and so forth. The drones, the tapping into our emails and so forth has just become draconian.
And what you get is, it's almost as though the crime guy, you know, it took over. And you get a very different culture in psychology, which is, okay, this is how we run the world. It's perfectly okay. We have no obligation to the general population, you know, and it's this notion of a breakaway civilization. You know, our learning speeds and their learning speeds are gapping so dramatically, we're just going to pull away. And that's why I asked the question, you know, if you steal $40 trillion, dividends and interest on $40 trillion, you know, at 5% is $2 trillion a year. That's enough to run a global government, you know, plus Army, plus Navy. So, you know, did they decide we've had it with this governance structure, we're just gonna do it? Here's the $64,000 question: where'd the $40 trillion go? Because it's some financing black budget operations, but my question is, did they basically create an endowment to privatize the government? So you're coming into a point when you're going to have to tell people bad news about, you know, sort of their retirement. Think of this as a way of sort of saying, do we want to spend the money on nursing homes or on space? So we just move the money out, put it in a private endowment, then we tell everybody there's no money, and then they'll have to adjust.
I hope you've enjoyed part 2 of our documentary, A Century of War. Catch this segment on youtube.com/watchingthehawks and on our Watching the Hawks page at rt.com. Join me tomorrow for part 3 of the documentary as we look at the missed opportunity of failing to properly pursue nuclear fission and fusion energy for peaceful ends. Perhaps the future of energy production will start with a single atom. I'm Sean Stone signing off. Have a good night.